Hello, parents. What's up? This is Seth with SethPerlo.com and TEFOS, the Executive Function Online Summit. Really glad you're here. I'm here with Dr. Sharon Saline. She is an ADHD nerd expert, author, speaker. She's interested in LD kids, kids with learning disabilities, and kids like well, she mentioned. She'll give more of a better introduction in a moment. But we got to know each other earlier this year. She has an amazing energy and passion for helping kids and families. And as far as I've seen, she's always positive. I'm sure she's not always, but she's what I've seen. She's just got a great vibe, and I'm really excited to have you here today.
Thank you so much. You also have a great vibe, and I am thrilled to be here to talk about grit and motivation and getting our kids who are alternative learners up and going.
Well, before you even get into that, because I want to ask you about that, tell me more about you. What do you want? These parents are here. They're looking for answers for their kids. The parents that are showing up are parents that really care and are really involved and are taking action. What do you want them to know about you and your background?
I am so thrilled that you're here and that I'm here with you. It's great that you're showing up. Bravo. I'm a clinical psychologist. I have a private practice in Western Massachusetts. I also, as Seth said, I'm an author and I speak internationally. And I have a background in theater. Where in my free time, I create my own cabaret shows. So that's what I think I want people to know.
All right. And then as far as you had mentioned grit, what are they going to learn about today?
So today what we're going to talk about is one of the things I'm passionate about, which is how can we motivate alternative learners, how to get things done? How can we manage our self-control and collaborate with our kids to create an agenda that makes sense to them and that interests them and also addresses some of the things that we know that they need to do? So one of the things that I didn't say about myself, but I think I should say, is that I take a very integrative approach to working with families and kids. I'm interested in the body, the mind, and the spirit, and the emotions. So we're going to bring these things together, because if we don't work holistically with teens, we're not going to be able to get them on board with whatever we want to do.
Awesome. I am so with you. I call it spoke theory, where the spokes of a wheel, we have to work on these things from many different angles. It's not simplistic. We want to think that these kids aren't complicated and we can use a cookie cutter solution. That is absolutely not the case. And I like the term you use. I think you said alternative learners. I don't hear many people say that. Well, why do you choose those words?
Well, because I think that, so Debbie Reber has talked beautifully about kids who are differently wired. We're talking about kids who learn uniquely, who have a different set of expectations, different ways that they understand and absorb material. And these are different types of learners. And I like the word alternative because the other options are usually too negative for me. You know, these might be kids who are more visual learners. These might be kids who are more kinesthetic learners or experiential learners. These might be kids who are math whizzes. These might be kids who also struggle with mental health issues, whether it's anxiety, depression, trauma, oppositional behavior, and all of those mental health issues affect how they learn. So whether you have dyslexia or you have dyscalculia or you're high functioning autism or you have ADHD, the package, the soup of your brain is complicated. You're right.
Yeah, and I like that alternative is very, I don't know if destigmatizing is a word, but it doesn't trigger the negative stigmas, which I don't like, you know.
Right. I
Um,
don't like those either. And most of the kids I talk to don't like them. They say, I don't want to have a disability. I don't want to have a disorder. I think of a disability as an inability. I have abilities with things. You know, a disorder is I have, something wrong with me. There's nothing wrong with me. I just don't like doing that, or that I'm not good at that, or that isn't easy for me. And so the word alternative is very helpful because it's like, yes, you know what? You learn in your own unique, different way.
yeah, and I think that just sort of the other side of the coin is kids who respond well to traditional schooling are
Mhm.
just kids that have strengths in the areas that traditional schooling happens to be constructed around. But they have weaknesses too. They're just often not measured, so it's like the level field is playing. We all have strengths, we all have weaknesses. And what we want to do for all of our kids is find what the strengths are generally and build upon those rather than spending so much time and energy on working on the weaknesses. There's a time and a place for that, don't get me wrong.
Mhm.
But in our culture, we spend way too much energy on the weaknesses rather than finding and discovering their strengths and building on that.
Yes, there was in a particular field of family therapy and narrative therapy. It's called problem saturated thinking. So we want to shift out of that to what's working. We want to focus more on what's working and enhance that. We can bring up those challenges, but we want to really strengthen the things that kids already they feel good about themselves. Because ideally, the most important thing you want to leave high school with is a good sense of self-esteem and connection to mentors and family. If you don't have that sense of self-esteem and your ability to connect positively with others, it doesn't matter how well you can do math or science or social studies, that you're going to lack, and there's going to be a little bit of a hole. And we want to try to help kids, contain that, to make sure that hole isn't there, or if it's there, that they know how to plug it and unplug it if they need to.
In healthy ways, yeah. And
Exactly.
two more questions in sort of the intro. Well, first, what is the story behind why you care? How did you get in this, or why does this
Mhm.
matter to you? Because I only want people on here that are passionate, and you're passionate. Why?
Well, there are two reasons. One is that I grew up in a family with a younger brother who had undiagnosed, untreated ADHD. And as a sibling, I witnessed a lot of tension, arguments, and dare I say trauma that I really couldn't do a lot about. And I think that's why I became a family and child psychologist, because I wanted to help other families do something differently, live differently. And what happens, it's so interesting, is that I found myself drawn to these families with kids who were alternative learners. And around that time, my nephew was diagnosed with ADHD. And then my brother, as happens so often, I'm sure you see this with families, my brother's like, oh my God, I have this too. And then all the pieces kind of clicked into place. And that's why I'm passionate, because I feel like kids who learn differently deserve the opportunity to express themselves fully and be accepted for who they are and accept themselves.
Sounds like you were really just built for this, like you're put here and things really.
I hope so. I really feel like my job is to help people improve their connections with each other, speak their truths, and build something that's loving and supportive, and also honest.
You said connection twice. I don't want to get into it right now, but I just noted that in my mind. I know we'll get into it later, but I think I hope parents are noticing that, because that is a very important word, and I'm interested in why that's so important for you that you've mentioned it twice already. Before we get into the bulk of the talk today, how do you, Sharon, define executive function, and what does that have to do with grit or what we're going to learn today? So we have parents here that are brand new to the concept. So
Mhm.
for the parent that's like, oh my gosh, I'm looking for help. What can I learn from this person, this Dr. Sharon Saline? Did I even, I know you, but I hope I said, is it
Yeah,
Saline?
Celine, you know, it,
Saline.
I think it was Selinsky, and it was shortened, in Ellis Island, so it's Celine.
So,
Whatever people call it, whatever.
so what is this Dr. Sharon Saline? So
Just call me Dr. Sharon. It's fine.
thank you. Um, So what is she gonna, what, um, oh boy, Seth is having a brain moment. So anyhow, how do you define executive function?
Mhm. So I want to take a little bit of a backward step. So our brain develops from the back to the front and the inside out. right? The back is our physiological brain center. It's often called the reptilian brain, and it's our heart rate, our breathing. It keeps us alive. The middle of the brain is often called the mammalian brain. It's the emotional brain. It's where our fight or flight, amygdala, a limbic brain lives. It controls our feelings. And the front of our brain is called the thinking brain, or the human brain. And this is where our prefrontal cortex is. And our prefrontal cortex is really the director of the entire brain. And so as we mature, the brain connects from the back to the front, and then from the front everywhere else, right? So our executive functioning skills are the role of this part of our brain. So if you take your hand and you put it up here and you say, oh my gosh, what were you thinking? Why did you do that? You're actually making contact with the executive functioning area of your brain. You're not going to do brain surgery and find, oh, okay, this is where working memory is. And oh, okay, this is where organization is. Instead, it's a set of skills that work together to execute activities, thoughts, behaviors. And I think it's really important that we remember that if we think about executive functioning skills, I want you to think about, for example, a sound engineer. Let's say, and I'm dating myself here, U2 goes into the studio to record some music, right? So we have Bono and The Edge and the rest of the band, and they each have they're in the recording studio. In the booth, we have a bunch of sound engineers. We have Bono's vocal engineer, we have his guitar engineer, we have somebody for The Edge, the drummer, et cetera, et cetera. These engineers are working together so that the music that U2 is producing is melodious. It's balanced. It comes together in a beautiful sound. And that is what our executive functioning skills do.
Awesome. So then to piggyback on that, if a student is struggling with executive function, or if you too was making music that wasn't coming out how they wanted it to, what's going on with the grit or with what's holding them back? And I also want to mention, when you're talking about the brain developing from the back forward, parents, that there's a lot of hope, because parents are often very worried that their kids are going to end up living in their basement when they're 40 years old with no relationship, no career, playing video games all day long. And the brain continues to develop until your child is around 25 or even 30 years old, the front part of the brain.
Right.
So there's a lot of hope and time if we have good interventions. But so
Thank you for saying that.
Yeah. So with the struggles with this, or the struggles with grit, or the struggles with you two, and how does that relate to executive function?
So executive functions connect to other parts of the brain through and facilitate these connections on different pathways. And these pathways are run through various neurotransmitters. And neurotransmitters are like ferries in the brain. So a message goes through a neuron and it has to get to the next neuron. And what it does is it connects with a neurotransmitter, and that neurotransmitter takes that message to the next neuron. Sometimes there are not enough neurotransmitters, there are not enough ferries in that gap, what we call the synapse. I like to think of it as a river. And sometimes there are too many ferries, okay? Or sometimes the ferries need to move, need to hang out in the gap more. There are lots of different scenarios. But the important part is that there are two types of neurotransmitters that are most affected in brains with ADHD, and that's dopamine and norepinephrine. And the reason that's important is because brains who are, of alternative learners don't really have enough dopamine or norepinephrine to make those connections in a timely, effective fashion. And so that's why people sometimes, a lot of people take medication and they find that helps, but pills don't teach skills. And so when people struggle with executive functions, they actually really need direct instruction. And that's what you're so good at.
I'm so with you there. I like that you said pills don't give skills. And while for some students it is magical, like it's a game changer, it still doesn't give the skills. And what you said, to reiterate, I want parents to hear this, is that direct instruction, and in teacher talk, there's what's called direct instruction, which means that you are directly teaching somebody a thing. And in this case, direct instruction may simply be directly instructing or teaching kids how to use folders. So we think that they're
Right.
going to get it through osmosis. We think they're going to learn how to use the planner through osmosis because it seems like other kids do. They don't, but they picked up on the subtle direct instruction that teachers have been peppering throughout the years. But the kids who struggle with executive function, it went in one ear and out the other, and they never integrated it. So thank you so much for saying
That's
that.
right. And there's just something I want to say, which is that medication helps kids be available to learn these skills and integrate them into their brains and bodies more efficiently. Um, but medication alone is just not enough. And so when we talk about teaching skills, you're absolutely right that you can't, there's no miracle osmosis for learning executive functioning skills for kids who are alternative learners. It's repetition, it's practice. Practice makes progress.
I could not have said it better myself. And I'll say one, I hate to interrupt, but it's so on target. I mean, we could just go back and forth for so long, but on the repetition part, parents, a lot of times what we do as adults, parents and teachers, is we try to use logic or rationalizing or reason or lecturing or nagging to say, don't you see your life would be so much easier if you just blank. And I never do that with my students because it doesn't work. And so what I tell people that part of my secret is like, I'm just walking repetition. I'm just walking them through the process a million times over and refining a little bit each time. So but I think it's crazy making sometimes for parents who are like, oh, if you would just do this thing, but
It's super frustrating, and no parent really wants to be a reminding machine. And one of the things I'm going to talk about, or we can talk about now, is that we have to use cues. These kids need to learn how to create cues and follow cues. So we want to use visual cues, and that means lists. That means check, whether you have like the schedule on a whiteboard, and then you basically want to direct your child to what you have posted so that they can learn how to prioritize, so that they can learn how to organize themselves and see, okay, it's this or that. I mean, one mother I work with of a younger child basically took a picture of her daughter every year on the first day of school, coat, backpack, lunch, and then developed it or printed it out and put it on the refrigerator. And every morning when the daughter would come down and say, I'm ready for school, the mom would say, do you look like that picture yet? And so that allowed the girl to be able to have some autonomy to build those critical skills of independence and to have a guide. And isn't that what we want, right?
and the parent's not the one who's saying, well, here are all the
Exactly.
things. They're empowering the child to have agency and look at the thing. I often talk about pull yourself out of the conversation. You're having the same robotic conversation over and over with your child, and
Right.
you practically have a script. You want to get out of that and transfer the responsibility over to them in sane and useful ways. I do want to dive into that a little bit more, but I'm going to backtrack and wrap up this part. So
Mhm.
we're getting into the meat of it, and what Dr. Sharon and I just kind of did is we went a little bit further than I intended. So I'm going to pull it back a little bit, and then we'll dive back in. So for you parents who are taking notes. So Dr. Sharon, what is your A to B? So I want you to think about, the parents that are watching this, they have a child who's struggling. They're at point A, they're really struggling and stuck. They go to point B and they've turned a corner. It's not perfect, but they've moved the needle. They've turned a corner. They're clearly on a different path. And you've taken your clients on a process to
Mhm.
get to this point. So what is A? And you've already talked a lot about it, but anything that you left out, what is the A? What
Mhm.
does it look like when the change has happened? And how do you know? And then sort of what things happened to get there?
Great question. So A is disconnection, argument, disrespect, and dishonesty. A is filled with the D words. uh, to get to B, and I talked about this in my book and in my ADHD solution deck, we want to rely on the 5 C's: self-control, compassion, collaboration, consistency, and celebration. And I'll say a little bit about how that works. Self-control. You, parents, you're going to manage yourselves first before you deal with your kids. If you are dysregulated, if you are off your center, you are just basically taking kindling and throwing it on the budding flames of your child's dysregulation. Doesn't help you and doesn't help them. So we want to help, I want to help you as parents regulate yourselves first. And the way you're going to do that is by being proactive, by noticing the signs physically of when you are starting to head off the cliff. Think about, for those of you who can remember, think about the Roadrunner and Bugs Bunny. You know, he would run, and the Roadrunner would get off the cliff and he would just stand there in the air and then drop down, right? So I want to get to you before you get to the edge of that cliff, okay? And second thing, we want to be compassionate. We want to remember that we're doing the best we can with the tools that we have, and so are our kids. Our kids want to be met where they are. They want to feel like they're accepted for who they are and not judged. And that's a really hard thing when you're a parent and you're so frustrated with your kid. However, reflective listening, which is being able to repeat back what you hear your child say, is so important, and not aiming for perfection, not from you and not from them. Collaboration, we want to work together for solutions. If your kids are not part of the solutions, there's no buy-in. It's not going to happen. And we want to, of course, use incentives. We don't want to use punishment because punishment has been found not to work. Does that mean that there won't be consequences? No. We're going to use logical consequences, natural consequences. You drive my car, even though I tell you not to go out and take my car when I'm visiting grandma, and you hit the stop sign, guess what? We're working together. You're going to help pay for repairing the car. You're going to sit with me while I call the insurance companies. You're going to come with me while I get the estimate, and you're going to be riding your bike while there's no car. You know, that is a logical consequence. And these consequences teach lessons. And that's what I'm focused on. What kinds of lessons can we compassionately communicate to kids? We're going to strive to do the best we can. We're not striving for perfection. We're striving for steadiness. And we're going to notice efforting our own, like when we do something different, we're trying. We may not make it all the way, but we're trying. And we're going to notice our kids. Maria Montessori said, practice makes progress. That's what we want to focus on. And we want to celebrate. We want to celebrate small accomplishments and big ones. You don't have to bake a cake when your child clears the dinner table, but a high five is fine, you know? Let's try to notice when things are going well. Kids really need that. You know, the positivity ratio, according to various experts, is anywhere from 3-to-1 to 5-to-1. So that means 3 positives for every negative. Most parents I talk to say that they think their kids are getting anywhere from 15 negatives for every positive to 30 negatives. Kids have told me themselves. They'll say, Dr. Sharon, you mean what other people tell me or what I tell myself? And I'll say, okay, both. And they'll say, oh, it's 30 at least a day. That's not going to build that self-esteem.
Awesome. That every single thing that Dr. Sharon just said is what I teach. I just use different words for it. And that was so rich. Every single one you just said, we could completely unpack for a half hour or an hour.
Thanks.
I'm like, in my mind right now, I'm like, where do we go from here? Like, do I want to revisit those because they're so good, or do we move on? But we do want to get into the grit. So before we get, well, you can get into the grit with this, but in terms of the 5 C's, what are some of the biggest things that hold parents back from doing that naturally? Why wouldn't they just do it? What's going on? What makes it?
Great question. Frustration and grief. That's in my experience. And what I would call trauma repetition. So first of all, frustration. It is frustrating raising kids who are alternative learners. There's no way, there's no doubt about it. You do things, you have to repeat yourselves, they repeat their behaviors, it seems like they're not learning. It's very frustrating. So frustration impedes people from actually doing these 5 C's, which they know in their heart is the way that they actually want to parent. The second thing that I said, oh my God, um,
Frustration. You said the trauma was the third one.
trauma repetition was the third one. So frustration, and I'm going to come back to the second one
It'll pop back in
when my middle-aged brain gets it. So I want to say something about trauma repetition. A lot of parents who have kids who are alternative learners were alternative learners themselves. And so we carry around a backpack. It's invisible, but it's our invisible backpack of whatever school experiences we had, whatever social experiences we had, and our dreams and desires for our kids to either repeat the positive ones or avoid the negative ones. And so there are ways in which we push our agenda onto our kids, even though we don't mean to. And they have perhaps their own set of lessons to learn. In fact, I would say they have their own set of life lessons to learn. And sometimes they're going to listen to you and sometimes they're not. And so that sort of feeds that frustration again. And I think the third thing that I said was fatigue. So parents get tired. You know, they get tired. And I hope this is the third thing, because the second thing that was the third thing.
I think it was something else, but yeah.
Okay, well, you know, I'm happy to come back to it. So I think that the fatigue of actually being a parent 24/7 to kids who are demanding is more than you may have expected. And so there's a way in which you kind of back down. And was the other one maybe failure? Because I think that's something that also comes up, which is you feel like you're not succeeding, and so you just stop sometimes.
Yeah, I think what you're saying is very validating for parents to hear. And I say the same thing in different words as well. Like it is legitimately difficult. And it's okay. There's nothing wrong with you as a parent. You're not broken. And I'm glad you said about the repeating the trauma. And I guess the way that I describe that is we grow up with our own dysfunction. And what I don't want people to feel in this summit is that there's anything wrong with your family or anything like that. We all have dysfunction. We all grew up with messages that once we become adults, we start saying, yeah, that's not my truth. You talked about speaking your truth earlier. As adults, we get to a point where we have that cognitive dissonance. We're like, yeah, that what my parents taught me or my grandparents or my teachers or whatever. But we've been patterned. So sometimes it's just coming out and we're repeating these things that we've learned, but unconsciously. And what's great about the summit or any deep inner work that you parents do is that when we are aware of the pattern, we can then finally do something about it, however slowly.
I agree. And I think the thing that's really important is you are doing the best you can with the tools that you have available. And the fact that you're participating in the summit is fabulous, because you're seeking new tools. And in that way, you are overcoming whatever your parents did. You're going beyond what you grew up with. And I want to commend you for that, because that's how you repair, intergenerational trauma.
Oh, I'm glad you used that word too. You all can look that one up.
So intergenerational trauma is trauma that goes from generation to generation. And we see this with racism. We see this with classism. We see this with ableism. And these are things that run through generations of families.
And when you're working with a family and their child's at point A, you're trying to get them to point B, what's one of the biggest myths or misunderstandings that you feel like parents come in with? That they're just like, oh my gosh, you're right. That's not, I thought of it this way for so long.
One of the biggest myths that I see among parents is, and I'm trying to say this in a nice way, but it would be a negative assumption about what your child doesn't want. So what I see a lot is parents making judgments, negative judgments about their kids, that their kid actually, based on whatever facade your child is presenting you, instead of actually really considering something. And so this is what I would want you to consider as a truth. Is it better to do well, or is it better to do not well? What do you think your child would rather do in their heart? They want to do well. That's what Ross Greene talked about. Dr. Ross Greene, fabulous psychologist, wrote a book called Lost at School, wrote about a number of wonderful books. Oh my God, here we go. Middle-aged brain. The Explosive
It's all
Child.
good, but the explosive child, but they want to do well.
In their heart, they want to do well. They may have lost confidence. They may have lost faith in adults who have not led them down the path or assisted them in doing well. And they may have given up on themselves. And so the myth is my child doesn't care. And the reality is your child has lost their way.
Yeah. Thanks. And that is so congruent with what everybody else is saying. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
They want to do well. And I often find that as they get older, more into middle school and high school, they start to get more and more jaded as they've worked so hard to try to do well. They eventually get to the point where they do start to get to, why try? You know, this is exhausting. I'm putting forth so much effort, nobody's noticing. And that goes back to what you said a moment ago. And you said reward effort. You talked about punishment and reward. I may not be using your words exactly right, but you had that nuanced word, effort, reward effort. And that's what I do all the time is I look at the kid and I say, oh, wow, you did that. That was great. You just tried to do blah, blah, blah. Like I'm noticing the effort.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
often parents with the dynamic and the conflict, they're focused on the outcome rather than.
Right. So we want to focus on that efforting, because maybe your child doesn't do the entire math homework, but does 3 problems, which is better than what they did 2 weeks ago when they did 1 problem. You know, I think that we want to really focus on the progress, not the outcome, particularly for these alternative learners. There's so much focus in our society today on outcome, outcome, outcome. It's very hard to feel like you can measure up.
And again, if I were to say one of my secrets to making progress with kids that are resistant, that have had a bunch of negative experiences, and they're expecting that for me until they get to know me, and I'm sure you, one of my secrets to that is I notice what they're trying to do. And when we notice these tiny things, that is one of the biggest things that I'm able to get traction with them, to get them to take action and to take healthy risks for doing something they don't want to do, like using their planner or emailing a teacher or whatever, is by they feel safe, that they know that I'm going to notice a million things that they're trying to do. And that you know, rather than what we do, which is to say, you're not doing this right. Oh, you got an 89. Why didn't you get a 90? Oh, you cleaned up your bedroom. Why are those socks still on the floor? Like you said, the 15 negative positives, 15 negatives to 1 positive. We want to switch it around. I talk about the 3 to 1 rule as well. 3 positives to every 1 perceived negative, but they feel it deep.
Deep. And that's what Dr. Barbara Fredrickson talked about in her book, Positivity. It's like, you know, it's about a growth mindset. You know, a growth mindset is when you basically say, oh, I made a mistake. I'm going to, you know, how can I learn from that? Versus a fixed mindset is, I made a mistake. I'm a loser.
Yeah, I'm so stupid. I can't do anything right, blah, blah, blah. Yeah.
And I think one of the reasons, you know, I was just thinking about this, why I'm passionate about this work, is I grew up in a family with fixed mindsets. And I really want to, you know, I've spent my whole life working on myself to change that. And so I want to help kids and parents create the kind of resilience that's so important, that feeds growth mindsets.
So that is a great segue into the grit and into the final part of this body of this session, which is, you know, basically we're getting to this point B, what processes and actions happened. And I know you wanted to focus a lot on what is motivation and grit and how do we use that So how do parents take action and use that grit or that concept to help support their child who's stuck?
So I think a lot of people believe that kids with ADHD don't have grit. And I
Well, let's
actually
define it first. What's grit?
So a lot of people say grit is like that thing that you sort of stick to itiveness. You can bear down and suck it up and make it through. And they say, well, kids with ADHD don't have that because they lack motivation and they lack goal-directed persistence and sustained attention. All of these are executive functioning skills, of course. And I would say, flip that on its head, baby, because actually these kids have more grit than you do, because these kids go to school every day, or right now, as we're facing hybrid learning this fall, stay home and have to apply themselves to things they cannot stand, that they don't feel is inherently rewarding. And that's something I want to say. There are two types of motivation. There's external motivation and there's internal motivation. Intrinsic motivation, excuse me. So extrinsic motivation is, something that's outside of you. I don't do my laundry for 6 weeks. I'm going to have 8 loads and nothing to wear. You have to do something to get something, right? It's natural and logical consequences. Intrinsic motivation is I want to do something because it makes me feel good, right? The goals that we set for ourselves inside of ourselves. So the first one, extrinsic motivation, if I don't bring my permission form into school to take driver's ed or go on the field trip, I can't do those things, right? Intrinsic motivation is I want to do well on my test because that will make me feel good because I know this material. And this capacity comes into being in neurotypical brains in the late teens or early 20s. And so if we add those 3 years that it takes for a little bit longer for our ADHD brains to mature, we're talking early to mid 20s. And so we have to remember that it's going to take kids longer to develop intrinsic motivation. And we develop intrinsic motivation through extrinsic motivation. So I don't know about you, but at night after I work, I'm tired, I have dinner, and I really just want to kind of like sit on the couch and watch my show, particularly right now. But I do my dishes because I know that if I don't do my dishes before I watch my show, I'm going to be too tired after, and I'm not going to do them. And then I'm going to wake up in the morning to a sink full of dishes when I don't have time, and they're going to be gross. So I set up an agreement with myself. You do your dishes, then you watch your show. This is what we want to teach kids to do. We can't expect them to suddenly know how to do this. That's that miracle osmosis that doesn't happen, right?
Yes, I'm going to reiterate your term, direct instruction. We have to.
That's right. So, so what we want to do is we want to help kids with extrinsic motivation. And how are we going to do that? So the first thing is we want to think about procrastination. So what are the different kinds of procrastination? There's avoidance procrastination. I need a fire under me to get started. There's got to be a sense of urgency. Perfectionism procrastination. If I can't do it exactly right, I'm not going to get started. Okay, and so these types of procrastination prevent kids from moving along, right? Now, I mentioned grit. So I've kind of broken grit down into a little formula to help parents and kids do it differently. So I'm assuming that you have grit because I can see that kids who are alternative learners have motivation to do things they like. That's not the challenge with ADHD brains. Because dopamine is a neurotransmitter that works along the reward pathways of the brain. Things that are interesting are rewarding. Things that are less interesting are not rewarding. So it's easy to do the things that are interesting because there's enough dopamine to make that happen. It's harder to do the things that are uninteresting because there's just not enough dopamine. So that's when we have to use environmental supports to make that happen. So I'm going to just go ahead and say the sort of the breakdown of grit that I have. So G, get situated. Think about your goals. Talk with your kids about their goals. Choose wisely and order them by priority. And whether that's your assignments or your chores, you're going to, G is get situated. Make the situation work for you so you can do what you need to. R, resist distraction. Kind of tough. We're going to set reminders. Ask yourself how long, ask your kids, how long can you do something before you get bored? Is it 20 minutes? Do your tasks in 20-minute chunks. Is it 5 minutes? Do your tasks in 5-minute chunks. When you leave what you're doing, particularly for kids who are teens and they're working in school, write a note, use a Post-it about where I was so that when you come back, you know what to get into, okay? Take a time to break. Don't try to do something for an hour if that's an unrealistic expectation with your kids. We want to avoid that criticism and negative self-talk. I, use incentives that matter. Kids have things they want. And sometimes it's a new iPhone. Sometimes it's more screen time. Sometimes it's actually, going shopping or maybe just hanging out with you, baking cookies or, going for ice cream. We want to incentivize things. Now, I don't want to disincentivize time together. What I want to do is say, we're going to spend time together. If you complete this, we go out for ice cream. If you don't, we're going to clean your room. So you're together regardless, you're connecting. It's what the activity actually is. So you want to start with small steps. One of the things that helps deal with procrastination is breaking things down into small chunks. If your child can't get started, that chunk is too big. So you want to, again, identify achievable goals. And if it hasn't happened, then that's information for you. It's not failure. When things aren't working, it's not failure. It's like your GPS is telling you, recalculate. You want to reorient. And the T, take small steps and talk yourself through the tasks positively. Kids with ADHD often will talk to themselves, I need to go get my shoes. I'm going to get my shoes. I got to get my shoes. This helps with them hold things in their working memory. We want to support that instead of make fun of it or ask them not to do that. We want to help them talk to themselves, talk them through tasks. This is a very important thing for them to learn how to do. And then I want you to think about having a dinner with your family at night where everybody goes around and says something good about their day. This is really important. We want to shift. If we want to shift out of that negative outlook into something positive, we have to model how to do that.
Excellent. And you had mentioned connection so many times. And then earlier you had mentioned buy-in, and I can hear parents, you just listed so many actions, concrete things people can do. Thank you. And I can hear some parents saying, yeah, but that wouldn't work in my case because. And after the because is probably, and you'd probably agree with me on this, Sharon, but is probably my kid wouldn't do that because the buy-in's not there. And parents always ask me that question, how do we get buy-in? And you mentioned this connection, and I think that's how we get buy-in. And sometimes we have a lot of repair before we can even get there. But how do you define connection to a parent where you really want to be like, hey, let me give you the deep side of what works with families and what I've seen transform families.
So there are two comments. First of all, your child doesn't like arguing with you any more than you like arguing with them. Even if they're a teen and they're acting like they do, no. Who wants to live in a house with a lot of arguing? Nobody. And so the desire to argue less and cooperate and connect more is inside your child. Your child doesn't want to be nagged. They want things from you. Those things might be avoid them more, but they want something from you. And so that's really important. So what I want to say is that when your child is pushing back, is showing you that they don't want things, what we want to do is to say, well, I want us to have a home with less yelling. I think you want that too. So we're going to have to work together to make that happen. And I'd like to know what's one thing I can do differently, and what's one thing you think you could do differently. And then you reflect back. What I heard you say is that you would like me to stop nagging you in the morning. You want to follow your own routine. And what I heard you say about yourself is that it would help if I had a list of what you need to do, and I don't talk to you. I just remind you about the list. That's working with them. And it's a win-win, because you're getting something you want and they're getting something they want. It's just that you're leaning into their priorities right now to improve their buy-in. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, how much screen privileges are you giving your kids without them earning that first? So we want to put have tos before want tos. So that means that screen time is something that is an earned privilege. It's not a right. And so a lot of kids think it's their right. And what I would encourage you to do is set a baseline. You get an hour of screen time no matter what, unless you are going to inappropriate sites, or you're bullying, or you're posting inappropriate pictures. You get that hour. Anything beyond that hour, you're going to earn. And here are some ways that you can earn it. And that increases their buy-in. It helps them want to cooperate. They may not like this agreement, but right now you own the screens. And if that means you have to turn off your internet at night or whatever it is, there are lots of ways to help you control that. But it's really important.
Awesome. And I just was speaking to a parent the other day, and we were talking. It's a parent I've known for years. And I noticed, because of attunement and because of co-regulating and really being attentive to what she was saying, I noticed that when I gave her a suggestion, unlike the other things we were talking about, there was this silence. And I'm like, I don't think you're bought into this one. And she said, and this is relevant to the electronics discussion, but she said, well, I know if I try to impose that boundary, that my kid's just going to be able to convince me otherwise somehow. My kid is able to get me to do whatever. So what do you say to the parent that feels like, yeah, I would love to have that conversation, but I don't even know, I don't think I'm going to get them to listen to me? Or
there is a hierarchical structure in families. Let's be real. And you parents, you have authority. And what I think happens, not authority like, I'm an authoritarian, but you have a certain amount of authority that you should have. Your job is to raise adults, right? And you've been there, and you know that there are certain things that work and certain things that don't, and certain things that are okay and certain things that aren't. And so I think sometimes what happens is parents become afraid of their kids. They become afraid of disappointing their kids, of their kids being upset with them, of their kids not liking them. And I'm going to say, and this may not be popular, but you are not your child's friend. You are your child's parent. And I've had hard times parenting some of my kids at times. I mean, really hard times. And but if you go out and you're drinking at a party, and I get called because the police are there, I'm stepping in as an adult. I'm not stepping in as your friend. That's not my job. And so I think sometimes parents are afraid to set limits with their kids that their kids desperately need. And I've seen this a lot lately, Seth, particularly for parents of middle schoolers, where during this COVID spring of 2020, where parents just gave their kids a lot of screen time, and their kids were really cranky and really disrespectful and not sleeping. And we worked to just rein that in a bit. What happened is that it's not like the kids came in and said, thank you, but they shifted. They became more of themselves. And they didn't like it initially, but they cooperated. So when your kid is arguing with you, I would encourage you to sit down and say, here's the deal. We're gonna talk. A lot of kids with who are alternative learners think negotiation means you're going to give in to me. You, parent, are going to give in to me. Negotiation is a process of compromise where no one is happy with the solution. and it's in the middle somewhere. And that's the position that I would like to see parents take more.
And I think when you, at the very beginning of what you're talking about today, I just want to tie these two concepts together, but you were saying that the parent needs to regulate.
Right.
And here, what I hear you saying is that when your child gives you pushback and you're dysregulated, you're
Mhm.
not going to be able to make those sorts of rational agreements. So it really does come back to doing our own deep inner work, which can be a lot of work and a lot of undoing of what we learned or our old traumas and things like that, to be able to stand with that sort of groundedness in what our real beliefs are about what our kid needs, so that we can do the right thing even when it's difficult and they're pushing us and they're pushing our buttons and they're challenging us. Their job is to challenge us. I mean, they're at an age when they're trying to find the
Exactly.
boundaries. They
Exactly.
want to know them. They will never say that.
Well, it's, it's like when you push up against something and there's nothing there, you just push through and you
Yep.
fall. And so what we want for parents is to understand, I'm not talking about like, I'm the boss, you do what I
Right.
say because I said so. I'm talking about, you're the parent. I'm listening. I heard what you said. Here's what I think. We can try to meet in the middle sometimes. And sometimes it's more appropriate for me to sort of say, this is how it's going to be. And occasionally you get to say how this is going to be too. When it is, when it's not an issue of safety or healthy living or, other things like that.
Awesome. So 3 more quick questions and we're wrapped up here. The first one is, this week, so the parents are at the summit, they're looking for answers. They're overwhelmed because there have been so many great speakers and their minds are filled with all these things. So this week, after it's all over, when the mud settles a little bit, what specific action or actions might you, if you had a magic wand, encourage them to take this week to just get moving in the right direction?
So the first thing that I would do is sit down in a calm moment with your kids and say, I want us to yell less. I want us to argue less. And so let's try to identify what's one thing that triggers some of these arguments. And let's brainstorm alternatives so that when things are building, we can step back, settle our nervous system, which takes somewhere between 10 and 15 minutes, by the way, and then come back together. Okay, so I want you to think about this. I call this stop, think, act. You call pause in the action, you separate, you come back together, you discuss what happened, right? And then you choose the next right action. You're not going to solve the whole problem. You just want to know how to move forward. Later, maybe tomorrow, you can come back and deal with it. But still, right afterwards, even if you're coming back to talk, the emotions are still very sensitive. So that's the first thing I would say. We want to manage ourselves using stop, think, act. The second thing I want you to do is have compassion for yourself and for your child. Meet your child where they are, not where you think they should be. Meet yourself where you are, not where you think you should be. Okay? Remember, we're doing the best we can with the resources we have available to us at that time. And for kids with ADHD or LD or ASD, a lot of labels here, they may not be able to access what they know is the right thing to do in a timely enough fashion. And so instead of punishing them, we want to open ourselves to the possibility that actually they just couldn't pull it out of their memory bank or process it quickly enough. So that's the second thing. And the third thing I want you to think about is motivation. So what gets in the way? What kinds of procrastination techniques does your child use? And how could you create a grit program? Remember, get situated. Do you remember what the other one was? Resist distraction, use incentives, take small steps, and talk to yourself. So how can you create a grit program for one thing? One thing. Because people can only change one thing at a time. Really. Think about yourself. You know, like my husband will be like, I want you to keep, keep your bag off the counter and turn the light off when you come in, and, make sure that, there's no dishes in the sink when you leave in the morning. And I'm like, which thing? Which thing? Oh, I think one of his things was stop interrupting me. Of course, he picked stop interrupting. I'm like, dude, that's the hardest one. One thing.
Awesome. And then 2 more questions. And this one I know you've touched on a lot, but and I think you were talking about the hybrid classroom, but during this pandemic, with all of the uncertainty that's coming up, what's one of the biggest concerns or worries or complaints that you're hearing from parents, and what's your gut response to one of those?
Mm-hmm. So what I'm hearing from parents a lot is that kids are refusing school. There's not just Zoom fatigue, but there's Zoom refusal. And they don't want to do it anymore. They can't look at the screen. They don't want to learn that way. It's boring. A lot of schools have not particularly been using engaging techniques like polls or breakout rooms or smaller groups where alternative learners can actually participate. They're hiding they're hiding their learning challenges off screen, and they're also not getting supports. So what I would feel very strongly about is that kids who have ADHD or a learning disability or are diagnosed on the autism spectrum must have their IEPs revisited. And if they don't have their IEPs revisited, then you want not even, like, revisit the IEP. And if your child has a 504 but actually needs to have that 504 intensified to an IEP, let's negotiate that as soon as possible. Number one. Number two, we want teens especially to have one-on-one time with someone who is an educator during the course of a week. And for alternative learners, it's best if it's once a day. I work with a teenager, and he's in a supportive learning class, and he meets with a teacher and one other student, and for 45 minutes a day to do homework together. So I want to make sure that your child gets what they need in the learning environment.
And just to be clear, that can be online.
Mm-hmm.
What you
Yes.
just said, yeah.
So how that can be online is because when kids are refusing to go to Zoom or refusing Zoom school, they're bored out of their mind. It's not engaging to them.
It's not.
And I don't think it's up to the parents to make the school more engaging. It's up to the school. And so if your child has learning needs and is not engaging with the learning, that's kind of the school's responsibility. You have the technology. That's a whole nother issue, which is due to there's inadequate and uneven access to technology in our country. And so people who have housing insecurity or work or economic insecurity often cannot get Wi-Fi. They're driving 45 minutes to McDonald's so they can do that, or they're driving another hour to sit in the parking lot of a library. So it's important to ask schools, how are you going to make sure my child has access to the education that you're providing? And so, parents, we're going to, put on your big girl, your big boy pants and be like, this is what my child is entitled to.
Yeah. Such complicated issues. I did a vlog before the pandemic happened. That was, what's the biggest problem with education? And it's engagement anyway.
Mm-hmm.
So now there's even less engagement, and it makes sense. So very difficult time, because we just want to see our kids get some good things out of education. And all right, here's our last question. And that is my favorite. And it is to look right in the camera, and you're looking at these parents who are new here and who are really they're really concerned, looking for solutions. So from your heart, and forget I'm here, but straight to their heart, this person who's really seeking, what's the most important takeaway you hope they leave with right now?
The most important takeaway I would like you to leave with is, above all, the key to success in parenting is maintaining and nurturing your connection with your child. That's what's most important here, not whether your child gets an A in physics or a C in English. It's how are you going to keep your home as a place that actually is a place of love and care, and that you feel safe and your kid feels safe. That's the most important thing. These are tools to help you usher your child into adulthood successfully, out of this ground of love and compassion.
Awesome. I love how you wrap it back to connection in relationship, because
The
that's how
five
I start
C's,
every presentation and end every presentation of mine. It's that relationship's number one.
the 5 C's equal the big C, connection.
Right on. Awesome, Dr. Sharon. Well, thank you so much for being here. If you click on the link for Dr. Sharon here, you can learn all about her and her offerings and what she does. And thank you so much for showing up here.
Thank you so much for having me. As always, it's great to talk to you. And thank you so much, parents, for tuning in. Bravo to you, and keep up the good work.
All right, parents, we'll see you in the next one. Take care.
Bye.